George Washington, first president of the United States, unanimously elected, served 2 terms and then stepped down because he didn't want to set a precedent of a monarchy, because that's what we had just broken away from. And that's what most presidents are going to follow until FDR. His leadership led to a standard of a strong presidency with control of foreign policy and the power to veto Congress's legislation. He is famous for declaring the Proclamation of Neutrality in April of 1793, which said that the U.S. was not going to get involved in European wars. He was scared of entangling alliances. He didn't really like political parties. Um, and he is going to support the idea that we should be an isolationistic country until we have, at least until we have developed ourselves more fully. The Judiciary Act of 1789. This is what's going to provide for a Supreme Court with a Chief Justice and at the time 5 associates, and it established the office as the Attorney General, and it created federal district courts and circuit courts. So it basically makes our entire judicial branch. Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury. I feel like I should be singing at this point. He proposed the federal assumption of state debts, the establishment of a national bank, and the federal stimulation of industry through excise taxes and tariffs. So he was really, really, really into economics of the country and making us as economically strong and viable as we could. He was also a very staunch Federalist. He had many opponents, including Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists, who thought his programs only helped out the rich or the elite at the expense of the average citizen because of how the taxes were going to be distributed. Ultimately, he is going to die from a gunshot that he got while he was dueling Jefferson's vice president, Aaron Burr. The Jeffersonian Democrats, or Republicans, or the Democratic Republicans, were the Anti-Federalists. These are going to be Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Madison kind of flip-flops at first, but he is largely known as a Democratic Republican. They favored states' rights and the power in the hands of the commoners. The Southerners, particularly farmers and frontiersmen, were huge advocates of this theory. They believed that the federal government was denied all powers that were not expressly given to it in the Constitution, so they're called the strict interpretationists of the Constitution. And they supported the French Revolution's ideas, but they are against the radicalism of the French Revolution itself. Eli Whitney, inventor of the cotton gin, period. He invented the cotton gin in 1793, and this is what's going to allow cotton to be a profitable crop. Up until that point, cotton was so labor intensive that it didn't really yield enough benefits to justify the expense. So slavery was actually beginning to fade in popularity. And then once he invents the cotton gin, which he did because he wanted to help the slaves have an easier job. He wasn't trying to do anything else. He's just like, I'm going to make it easier for the slaves to do their work. It's going to make it so that cotton becomes king cotton, becomes so profitable that the demand for slavery increases. He also is going to establish the first factory to assemble muskets and interchangeable standardized parts. So that's also pretty important, although cotton gin is what we associate with him. His innovations led to what's called the American system of manufacturing, where you had laborers with less who could use tools and templates to make identical parts. It also called on the manufacture and assembly of parts that could be done separately. Jay's Treaty was an attempt to settle the conflict between the United States and England over commerce, navigation, and various violations in the Treaty of Paris. So there were still tensions and issues after the Revolutionary War. Jay's Treaty was an effort at solving those. It provided for the eventual evacuation by the British of their posts in the Northwest, but allowed them to continue their fur trade. It allowed for the establishment of commissions to settle the U.S.-Canadian border disputes and U.S.-Britain losses during the Revolutionary War. So it just kind of worked out more of who got what land. And it was actually pretty generous terms to the British, which upset many Americans because these were promises that had been made and not fulfilled in the treaty. The Whiskey Rebellion were Western whiskey farmers who refused to pay taxes, on which Hamilton's revenue program was based, so they terrorized the tax collectors. And Washington, who was president at the time, orders out the state militia in order to go and put down this little rebellion. Washington and Hamilton rode out to Pennsylvania themselves to emphasize the commitment to the federal government, as well as the idea of you have to pay these taxes, we need them. So it was the first true test of federal authority. That's what the Whiskey Rebellion is important for. The first test of federal authority. And it established the federal government's right to enforce laws. Had this been the Articles of Confederation, the Whiskey Rebellion would probably have been successful, and the taxes would not have been paid. The Pinckney Treaty was signed by the U.S. and Spain, which granted free navigation of the Mississippi River to the U.S. We also gained Florida, and then some parts of modern day Mississippi and Alabama from this treaty. It gave Western farmers the right of deposit in New Orleans, which allowed them to use the port for their goods. It made it easier for them to get their goods to the east. The U.S. would later make the Louisiana Purchase, which would cement this right of deposit and would claim, triple the landmass of the United States at the time. In terms of early American literature and art, I know art isn't everybody's favorite thing, but apush loves culture. Early writings promoted the benefits of colonization to both Europeans and to the colonies themselves. The authors of these early documents were John Smith and William Penn. They were largely pamphlets or other forms of political or theoretical writings. Religious issues in the Great Awakening also provided material for written works, such as John Winthrop, Edward Winslow, Roger Williams, Jonathan Edwards, the Sinners of the Angry God, and George Whitefield. Political issues of the Revolution influenced writing in the mid-1700s, including works by Sam Adams, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Post-war writings, such as the Federalist Papers, explored the idea of American values and governmental structure. The first American novel, published in 1789, was William Hill Brown's The Power of Sympathy. I can't speak. That's going to be like a fun fact that you could toss in, perhaps. Art, in terms of visual art at the time, copied European styles, but was largely portraits in nature. This included pictures of famous Americans, and they were done by artists such as John Trumbull, Charles Peale, Ben West, and John Copley. The most famous was the portrait of George Washington, done by Gilbert Stuart, and this is the one that is currently on the $1 bill. John Adams, second president. He is known as the first vice president. He was a diplomat and signer of the Declaration of Independence. During his presidency, the United States faced the XYZ affair, the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. He is most important for having kept the nation out of war during his tenure as president. So the XYZ affair was the U.S. Was getting upset because the French had disrupted our trade. Kind of because they were more trying to go after the British, but we were kind of a byproduct of it. So to settle the issue, French representatives demanded a bribe from the U.S., just opened negotiations with the French minister Talleyrand, and the U.S. refused the bribe and suspended trade with the U.S., which led to the creation of the American Navy in order to protect our shores. The Alien and Sedition Acts, legislation enacted by the Federalists to reduce foreign influences and increase the power of the Federalists. New hurdles to citizenship were established, and it brought in power to, in an effort to quiet print media critics, because there were quite a few people who were, at this time, fairly outspoken. You also had the back and forth between the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. This legislation was used to silence Jeffersonian Republican critics of the Federalists and was indicative of the poisoned relations between the two groups. In other words, it showed the depth of disagreement between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. These acts tested the strength of the First Amendment in terms of freedom of the press, and the Federalists gained a reputation as being a less democratic group, which ultimately is going to lead to their demise as a political organization. Plus, really, once the Constitution was ratified, they just weren't needed anymore, because that was their primary focus. In terms of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, this was the response by Jeffersonian Republicans to the Alien and Sedition Acts. This is going to include texts written by both Jefferson as well as Madison. It suggested that states should have the power within their territory to nullify federal laws. So if the federal government wants to say prohibition, for example, then states could say, no, we don't like prohibition. This stated that the federal government had no right to exercise powers not specifically delegated to it. The resolutions represented a future argument that would be used when secession and civil war threatened a country. Should there be slavery? Should they not? Can states leave? All those were the source of debate for the Civil War, and they stemmed from the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. It called into question the paradox of both the Elastic Clause and the 10th Amendment. The Napoleonic Wars were a series of wars led by Napoleon Bonaparte in France against other European countries, particularly the British. Both sides tried to prevent neutral powers, especially the U.S., from trading with their enemies. American ships were seized by both sides, and American sailors were impressed. Not like, ooh, look at that boat, but more like, oh, you're forced into the British Navy. So it's like drafting them almost. It was like, you're going to join the British Navy or we're going to kill you. The U.S. was angered by this violation of the freedom of the seas principle, which holds that outside its territorial waters, a state cannot claim sovereignty over the seas. And eventually this dispute, as well as our hesitancy to choose sides, would escalate to the War of 1812. The Judiciary Act of 1801 created new judgeships to be filled by the president. Basically, it said, hey, we've got this idea of who gets to be Supreme Court justice. How do you pick the next justice? We know the president can pick it. Congress has to approve it. John Adams is going to fill the vacancies with party supporters, which he called the Midnight Judges, right before he left office, because Jefferson was taking over representing a different political party, and Adams wanted to make sure that the judges in position represented his political beliefs. This is going to lead to bitter resentment by the incoming Jeffersonian Republican Party, and it would play the center case in the Marbury v. Madison Supreme Court case, which is a hugely important Supreme Court case. Okay, we'll get to it in a second. So Jefferson becomes president. He's the third president, obviously wrote the Declaration of Independence, lived in Monticello, has got a pretty fancy little statue of himself in D.C. Before being president, he served as the first Secretary of State. He's also going to be the first president to live in Washington, D.C. His taking office was called the Revolution of 1800 because it was the first time the American political parties had switched. So we go from Washington and Adams, who were Federalists, to the Anti-Federalists of Thomas Jefferson. His embodiment of the Jeffersonian Republican Party helped increase its strength, while weak leadership in the Federalist Party was a reason for its demise. Jefferson's administration was responsible for the embargo of 1807, as well as the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, and his policies were mainly driven by support of states' rights. John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court from 1801 to 1835. He was one of the Midnight Judges. He was a Federalist installed by Adams. His decisions defined and strengthened the powers of the judicial branch and asserted the power of judicial review over federal legislation, basically saying that the Supreme Court had the right to hear trials and come to verdicts that were ultimately the supreme verdicts. His court made determinations that cemented a state vice of contracts. His court's decisions advanced capitalism, and significant cases during Marshall's term included Marbury v. Madison, Fletcher v. Peck, Dartmouth College v. Woodward, McCulloch v. Maryland, and Gibbons v. Ogden. In Marbury v. Madison, William Marbury had been commissioned Justice of the Peace in D.C. by President John Adams. He was one of the midnight appointments. Marbury's commission was not delivered until the next day, and Jefferson said, nope, we're not going to acknowledge it. You lose that commission. So he's going to sue Madison at the time, who was Secretary of State, and it's going to become a huge Supreme Court case. All these appeals and everything works its way on up, and Chief Justice John Marshall basically said that while Marbury was entitled to the commission, the statute that allowed Marbury's remedy was unconstitutional as it granted the Supreme Court beyond what the Constitution permitted. So basically it said, yeah, you're right, you should be the justice, but the way that you had to go about getting that verdict is unconstitutional in and of itself. So it's going to pave the way for judicial review, which gave courts the power to declare statutes unconstitutional. The Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson bought Louisiana and a whole bunch of other Midwestern states for $15 million from France. Jefferson was worried about the constitutionality of this because nothing in the Constitution directly gave him the right to buy more lands. And he was the one who said, you have to follow the Constitution to a T. So he's going to say, no, he's just making a treaty. So it was the presidential power of treaty making, not treat making, that allowed him to make the purchase. It was kind of a loophole, debatable as to whether or not it was constitutional. But all in all, it doubled the territory, and people liked this. The purchase helped remove France from the western borders of the U.S. Farmers could now send their goods down the Mississippi River and through New Orleans, facilitating transportation to Europe. The expansion westward created more states with Jeffersonian Republicans' representation to the point that the Federalists became a marginalized party. And it opened land to farming, helping fulfill one of the tenets of Jefferson's social ideology. So Louisiana Purchase was probably a good thing, but now we're going to be confronted with this question of, we have this lovely balance going of free and slave state in Congress. What happens when these new territories apply for statehood? Are they going to be free, or are they going to be slave? Cliffhanger, dun 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 dun.